I was asked some time ago to illustrate Treasure Island by Rober Louis Stevenson. Fantastic book, beautifully illustrated by N.C. Wyeth. And I was young enough, dumb enough, and had enough hubris to take it on. To this day, I'm not sure it was a great decision, but phenomenal project from the great folks over at Folio Society. So, you all are looking at your current project, and with that project, you may be asking, where do I begin? I don't have time to read the entire book. That's typically what you would do if you had a illustrated manuscript that you're going through. I don't usually read the entirety of a book for the cover, but because I've given you an interior illustration, you do have to go through and choose a scene. Step one in a situation like this, because it's not an actual project, it's okay if you take one of the projects, you close your eyes and you say, I'm going to do this one. And then you say, well, this is the chapter. And you close your eyes again and you point to the book and you randomly choose a chapter. And you might say, yeah, but Sterling, that's totally random. And why would I do that? The reality is that when you're working professionally, you put your work out there and you get the jobs that you get. You don't necessarily get to choose what comes in. You just get to choose whether or not you do the project. So in this instance, you can start and be completely random, choose that, and then within the constraints of the project, you make it as compelling as you possibly can. I think a place where students make a mistake in all of this is they try to find the right project that they really want to do. And some of that's okay, but what you end up doing is you give yourself permission to quit, to get out of the project, to squirm, to do something else. And one of the things that really has to be learned is that discipline to stay true to the project, which is frankly a lot easier if you're getting paid to do it. There's client expectations and all that. I get it. But for now, we can just randomly pick, point, and choose, and that's fine. And then we'll go through. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we start to go through our project. And I will go as far as getting a cheap version of something. I will highlight, I will underline, I will start writing notes. And I oftentimes have a series of note cards next to me. And if something's a really compelling scene, then I'll take a moment and I'll actually flesh it out. But we have to go through the entirety of a manuscript if we're going to illustrate the entirety of the project, because we need to have character consistency. We need to understand that one scene has to flow into the next. We don't want all of our scenes to be static and all of them to be active. And we want to make sure that there's a variety of approaches in how we are actually creating the imagery to solve for the story. So you can see this version of Treasure Island. It's rife with notes in here of things that I've sketched, things that I've written. And this is just my research. This is the initial research stage of processing where I want this to go. Now it's a far cry from here to the finished book. This is actually the slipcase. That's the book cover. And there's many steps that has to happen in between, but for me, it actually begins here. This is the sketchbook that I dedicated to this particular project, and I tend to do this on larger projects where I want to be able to go back and find a consolidated reference point for the project to understand it, know where these things live, because you never know. Life gets in the way, things get interrupted, and if you're working on a project that's taking 3 months, 6 months to a year, you may get other assignments that come in. You might have a life situation that comes in, and you want to know right where your stuff is so you can jump back to it. This also, as a professor, as an instructor, gives me a great teaching resource to go back to and say, this is where Treasure Island sketches live. So the way that I use this, first of all, I get a sketchbook that is relatively inexpensive. You can see I have a lot of blank pages in this. The point is not to fill it up. The point, again, is to have a tracking record of what I've done in thinking about this project in totality. So this is kind of where I begin. And you'll see that I've got these note cards, as I mentioned, that I'm drawing on as I go in the note-taking from the original manuscript. And I've even got little places written in here where I've got space set aside for the slipcover binding, part 1. I start to go through and it just gives me a framework to begin with. I don't always use it religiously in that way, but it gives me a place again to have structure. And so much of the beginning stages of what we have to do as creators is just to give some organization to the chaos that is the project. Sketches here, these are initial, very rough sketches. I'm going to have a scanned PDF of all this stuff for you in this session as well. So you can go through and look at these more in high resolution. There's nothing terribly artful about them. This is just the process of how things begin. But you'll see that I do go through, I'll have page numbers on here, I'll have a written description from the scene, and I just start to work in line in the beginning of things that kind of catch my attention and try to figure out where they might go. This is page 15. That sketch translates directly over here. So this is one of the sketches, the thumbnails that I would have sent to the client, and ultimately that became one of the illustrations that I'll share with you as well. So you'll see different vignettes, and some of them are more fleshed out than others. I also tell you to start with icons, and there's a number of icons that start to come to the forefront as you're going through this process. Icons such as the pirate's parrot, a cutlass, the pirate's hat, the pirate's ship. All these things are still in the research stage, and we are trying to simplify our communication so that when we bring in these iconic elements, that they work in shape, they work in silhouette, and they help convey a sense of time, place, environment, character, all of those things from those additional elements as well. There was something here that was pretty fun, and there's a number of these sketches where I'm looking at a variety of options for the opening sequence. The client didn't tell me you need to illustrate this page. What they told me was that we need an illustration roughly every 8 to 12 pages, and that means that sometimes you're going to get to illustrate exactly what you want, but if the next scene that you have to illustrate is not either 12 pages before or 12 pages after or within that threshold, then you've got to sometimes illustrate a downbeat, something that's not a keyframe, but that's a different story beat that's not as significant to the storyline. And that's okay. That's going to help your story carry through as well. This scene would have been fun to illustrate. This is Pew as he's getting run over by the horses, but it just wasn't in the stars. This was the one that we ultimately went with for that particular segment of the story. And I think this is Billy Bones down here after he died. Jim is there with his mother, and they're finding the keys on his body. And that was a fun one to illustrate too. I like this scene. This would have been a fun one to illustrate too, where they're hiding out from the pirates, Jim and his mom under the bridge. But this scene went out. I needed an establishing shot of Bristol while showing the Hispaniola. So you can see that there's a number of sketches in here, and you might ask, yeah, but why is that sideways? I actually don't draw the boxes first most of the time. I will go through and start drawing shapes and trying to think about how I want to organize it, and then I will reframe the composition to fit everything in there relative to the proportions of the page. So all of these are thinner than they are tall. So this one has a little bit more boxy, but it relatively has those positions. This particular scene, I was never in love with this scene the way that Stevenson wrote it. Now, that might be blasphemy, but there was something about Jim hiding out in the apple barrel below deck to rest that didn't, like, how does a kid fit into an apple barrel? I mean, that'd have to be an enormous apple barrel. And this is the scene where these pirates are planning their mutiny. So Israel Hand is there. I've got some other folks that are there as well, and they're trying to convince one of the pirates that this mutiny is what they're going to do. And all these things said, I took a page from Cubism in order to kind of show that scene the way that I wanted to show it. And the way I envisioned it is they're below deck. I wanted to show the curvature of the ship, almost like they're up towards the middle or the front of the ship. I wanted to have it look as if we're looking down beneath the floors, that there's an opening on the second floor. You can see down below into the hold or something. And we're seeing Jim curled up in the apple barrel next to the pirates, dangerously close if he gets discovered, he's going to be killed. And then within the final illustration, I also had this knife in Israel Hand's hand hidden in the shadows. So it wasn't the feature, it was a secondary story element. And also imagine being sandwiched between these other two pirates saying, yeah, we're planning this mutiny. Are you in? How intimidating would this be for this pirate who may not be 100% on board, but certainly with that kind of pressure is probably not going to say no. So there's a lot of writing to these things. You'll just see kind of notes again, just making sure that I'm keeping track of things. This would have been a fun scene as well. This is where Jim is on the captain's cabin. He's surrounded by these men. I want to show the difference in scale. This is my thinking. He's a boy. They are men. I wanted to show the size difference between them. I think the reason I ultimately didn't go with this scene was I was committed to Jim and the apple barrel. And that point of view, I didn't want to get too gimmicky with this elevated raised point of view. I wanted to change camera angles throughout the piece. That's another thing that you want to consider as you're working on these projects, is that you are taking on the mantle of being the director, the casting agent. You're doing the costuming, you're doing the set design, and you're also the cinematographer, right? So the question comes up, where do you put the viewer? Or where do you place the camera if you had a camera that you were shooting the scene with? So there's something here of a bit of being a witness to something, looking through, again, different objects to see this kind of going on. That was interesting to me. Again, all of these are really dynamic in the way that they're sitting in the sketchbook page, but that's, again, because I'm redrawing the boxes. I have a light box, but then I start to draw. It's like my drawings go where they need to go, and then I reframe them overall. Another example here. This is where Silver ends up killing his crewmate on Skull Island. And I read that to my son when he was a bit younger than I should have, and that scene probably haunts him to this day. I'm a terrible father. No, I try to be a good dad, but I did do all the pirate voices, so maybe I made it too convincing. I don't know. Really liked this scene where the boat was flipping over in the surf. Again, not the scene we went with because it wasn't as important as this scene where the pirates are overtaking the fence of the stockade. And there's a couple places where I pay homage to Wyeth. And this is one of those scenes where Wyeth actually had a scene illustrating the pirates coming over from this vantage point, and I chose to actually show from behind them coming this way. So those are my little nods to Wyeth throughout this scene as well. This is Jim up in the crow's nest with Israel Hands chasing after him. This was the most direct nod to Wyeth, where he showed Jim pointing the flintlock pistols down at Israel Hand. He had the upper hand. I took it the moment before and actually showed Jim still trying to load the flintlock pistols to enhance the sense of drama in that scene. So there's little notes and little different things that are kind of happening throughout this, and this is kind of the closing scene that we went with. A number of things kind of go into the planning, especially get into slipcase covers and everything else. So going through different ideas here, trying to discover where this might lead, working with different icons, trying to play with design. So you can see that this is not the final cover, but it's where the final cover started. And if I'm being truthful, the final cover was my favorite thing that I got to illustrate or design. And they gave me full range to do whatever I wanted with the final cover. I'll come back to that in a moment. But choice of materials, I asked for the slipcase, see if that's something else that we could do, and they were supportive of all of that. So that is, in summary, just some of the sketches from Treasure Island. So back to the cover, what am I trying to say through this and why? Well, as I was going through this, one of the ideas that really stuck with me was this notion of Skull Island and reading about some of the things that were on Robert Louis Stevenson's mind as he was going through it. There's actually a sketch in here that he had of the original Skull Island. And it was a really cool thing to see, because I found out through all of that Stevenson returned home when his career was kind of failing and his health was not well. And as that was all happening, his wife's health wasn't well. So they ended up returning home, and there was a young boy about the age of Jim in the story who had taken over his room, who was paying board there, but he was an aspiring painter. And at night, Stevenson would go into his room and paint with him, and he started drawing Skull Island. And that map became the foundation of Treasure Island. So that seemed really critically important. And again, I started playing with this notion of these little skulls and really the topography map that kind of goes into those things. And of course, that kind of played ultimately into the slipcase cover. And that's what these lines are coming from. And the X serves a dual purpose. X marks the spot. It's the treasure map, but it's also the sign that someone has died, right? So just playing with different symbols like that gets pretty fun in the design. So back to the cover. The cover shows John Silver in silver, right? Maybe that's a little bit on the nose, but I wanted to do foil. I'm a big fan of foil. And I wanted to show him striding with intention. So he's moving with intention onto the island, and he's in a place where these seagulls, symbols, anytime the sailors start to get close to land, they know it because the seagulls will start getting closer to them. At least that's the mythology that I read. So I wanted to use the seagulls as if they were dormant or living on Skull Island, and now you have a human setting foot in this place for the first time in many years, and this just huge flock of seagulls ends up getting startled, and he's moving with intention this way while the seagulls are flying that way. Now they're abstracted on purpose, and there is one key in here that gives away that they are seagulls. It becomes the legend to solving the abstraction there. Do you see it? This seagull is critical to understanding that the rest are seagulls. Without it, it might read, but there is no definitive seagull there. I repeated that again on the back as they're dissipating, and had another seagull in isolation to help explain what else was going on. So that was the thinking behind there. And there's one last little Easter egg on here. If you can see it, I've hidden the parrot in the negative space on Silver's shoulder. So the cover was certainly my favorite image out of all of that. But it all began here in the sketchbook, working through the process. And these projects always begin with text. I hope that helps you on your sketches, your ideation a little bit. And again, don't be too worried about not choosing the perfect story. You'll make it the perfect story by the excellent work that you're doing. Or if you're working professionally, typically you'll get an email or some form of contact. And the client will reach out and say, "Hey, artist, my name is such and such. I am the art director at this publication or this company or wherever they're working. We have a project that we think that you'd be perfect for. It's about this, and it's going to be seen in this place or used in this way. We've got X number of days, weeks, months, maybe a year to get it done." And they might go as far as telling you who their target audience is, but typically that's built in to who the client is. If you're working for the New Yorker, you know that you're dealing with a sophisticated readership. If you're dealing with something like Entertainment Weekly, it's somebody who's more into pop culture. If you're dealing with highlights, then you know that you're going to be speaking to children. So this is kind of built into your understanding of who the client is. So that's not often or always explained. But if you get into a publisher, you're working with a publisher who has a wide base of different types of projects that they're doing, they will definitely tell you the target audience. So all of that information gets distilled down to something that looks a lot like this. You'll know the title, who wrote it, who the publisher is, relative size, page numbers, the number of pieces that you're doing. They'll tell you a deadline, maybe who it's targeting. And then there's also other aspects too, like where it's going to be seen, how long the duration of the campaign is going to be, things like that. So I think it's really important to be able to take that information and unpack it further. And this is what I refer to as the three-sided box. And I do this specifically so that I can work not only as an illustrator, but as a designer, as an entrepreneur, as somebody who's touching on some disciplines in science, health, and medicine, and different spaces, because these things that we find up here are not going to be consistent with all disciplines. But ideas like time, space, audience, industry, and content are. Here's an example of how this might work. So as far as time, that might be our deadline. All projects have deadlines, but there's also other time considerations. If you are working with a choreographer, time is going to be something different. Or you're working in an animation studio. A 5-minute feature is going to be different. A 5-minute short is going to be different than a 2-hour feature. And those types of things start to take on different contexts. But they are critical to every type of assignment that you will work on. Time is unavoidable. We start to think about space. In this instance, space is relative to the size of the project. So 8 inches by 10 inches, 13 illustrations, 230 pages. But space, again, is different to somebody who's doing a show at a museum or a gallery, or the space that might be relevant to somebody who's working in theater. We start to think about who the client is, the Folio Society here, and that's going to give us specific parameters relative to both industry, which is publishing here, as well as who that industry is solving for. That's the audience. And then ultimately we have Treasure Island. In this instance, that is going to be our content. So once we know that, we start to solve for those problems within limitations. And that's a huge difference between doing work with somebody else. I say with, not just for, but with somebody else, as opposed to doing something on your own. And it's not that these criteria aren't absolutely critical in your own personal project development, but you get to define oftentimes what those criteria are. And that's a bit of a change from what we're seeing here, because the client and the industry and the audience are dictating many of these things. So now our number one job is to communicate the content to the audience. That's what we're supposed to do. And we do it within these other limitations of time and space. Now, things get really interesting. I teach something that goes more in depth than this, but as you're starting to try to find your voice, we can drive and shape that intention even further. Because what often happens here is we still meander back and forth. Things are pretty wide open, and we don't have as clear of a target as we might think. But we can start to say, well, what are the themes of the book? What do they mean to me? And I like to pair opposing themes together. So in the Treasure Island book, maybe it's innocence versus corruption, right? Those opposing themes are at odds with each other. And because they're at odds with each other, they're at conflict, we're going to be drawn to the results that are influenced by that conflict. So these things create a Kermit the Frog face. More importantly, they start to create what's called a shaped charge. And our intention gets more focused as we narrow the scope even further. So this works as an idea for illustration projects. It works for a body of work. If you start to define what your governing principles are, your themes are in your own work, not just the client work, you certainly get to direct a body of work until you resolve that problem. You've answered the question to that problem through a lot of experimentation. All of that is really way down the line right now because those things are not critically important to what we're doing. But I want to let you know that this process goes deeper and it's something that builds on itself. It's modular. So that is the way that we would look at using the three-sided box to solve this problem, to arrive at a consensus with others that we're communicating with. Now, somebody in illustration may have no idea what the three-sided box is. This is my own device. But again, as I start to look out across new opportunities, these are the things that I find that are consistent with all projects that started off as problems, certainly within commercial opportunities. So here you'll see the finished cover, an example of an interior illustration, and it's a far cry from the original manuscript to get to any type of finished pieces. The first thing that I do is I start reading the text and I do my research. As I'm going, I will keep these note cards, make writings, scribbles, shorthand information to myself. These are not for anybody else. They're just for me to understand and to remember. And a number of these things start to find their way into the next round of sketches. So it's not surprising that some of these things ultimately are influencing the next step of what we do. All right, so that is really the first step. And then, as I start to move away from just the visual note-taking of the research, I do start to look for different elements in there, research elements, icons, something like this. It's a treasure chest. This is a kind of a low-res photograph that I have here. But there's a number of things that are going to come to the foreground, to the forefront here on iconic elements that make us think of pirates, sailboats, parrots, treasure, cutlasses, spyglasses, all these different things that maybe make us think of pirates. And we can start to leverage those icons and then contextualize them. All right, after that, the next step, you can see here, these are kind of batched together in slipcase consideration. So this is the front cover. You can see it kind of peeking through right here. And they're not the final design, but they're thinking through things. And then the actual cover of the book. So this is not quite where I went, but it started here. And you can see that that has a legacy ultimately that went there. Here we are with the title pages, and we went with this one. And at this stage, by the way, these are sketches that I'm showing to the art director. These sketches did not make it. I liked the idea of them, but they were too pastoral, they were too quiet, and ultimately I was considering those three sketches, and this is the one that was approved. And that is what you're seeing here. These three sketches, I really liked these two, but they didn't make it. And that's what we do. We end up iterating and we sacrifice things, and that's okay. That's part of the process. I like this one too. It just didn't make the cut. None of those made the cut, but this one did. I really like that one. It did not make it, but this one did. No, and yes. And some of these are self-editing. Some of these are feedback from the art director. And you have to remember that this is a collaboration. So, and this has been Gunn, and I've got him hiding kind of in the reeds on the beach. And then I have another loose sketch. The answer was actually, the solution was to put him in the tree in this format. All of these go together. You can see I've got my notes down below. Establishing shot, didn't need it. Interior shot, didn't need it. I like this one a lot. This is the boat that's turning over in the turmoil of the ocean there, the surf, and this is the one that was approved. No, but this was used on the end pages ultimately. No on this, and yes on that. No. Yes. Yes. And yes. So you can see that to get here to the thumbnail stage, which is exactly where you are on your current project, you're going to be working up your thumbnails. I drew them as well as I could. All of these things were drawn out of memory. No surprise there. They don't have a lot of fidelity to them. There's not a lot of detail, but memory or imagination, more imagination than memory. But I'm making up things. I'm composing them, and I do that very deliberately. I do not bring in specific reference at this point. I treat everything as research. It's information. I'm drawing from it for information. I'm not drawing from it for the visuals. You don't want to fall in love with someone else's photograph or someone else's artwork and end up copying that. That is not the path to a novel solution. And I told you, your value as a communicator, as an artist in any genre, is to find your novel voice. What is it about the things that you do that sets you apart from everybody else? So these are things that you have to consider as you go into it. All of us fall in love with a beautiful photograph. We want to paint it. That's not going to lead you anywhere. So getting to a place where you can draw from your imagination, even if it's fairly crude, as I'm doing here, it's enough to communicate intent. Your portfolio is proof that you can take the intention all the way to some level of professional finish. That's the trust, that's the faith that the creative director or the art director is putting in you, is that yes, you can go from here to there. Here's some insight into sketches. Don't put too much information in them. Don't put too much detail, because all of a sudden you're working from a reference shot and you've got his hand down here, the knife is here, his chin is up, and you decide to put it in color, and you come back with a sketch that deviates from that. The artist is going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. I liked his hand better before. But if you're loose, as I am here, then you have a lot more flexibility from this stage to final to do what you need to do with the piece to make it better. And that's ultimately what you want, is you want to just make these better from here. So the next step is to actually get to a stage of shooting my own reference, costuming wherever I can, setting the stage up, casting the characters. We are in this full-time role, fulfilling all the positions of a filmmaking studio. We're the director, because we didn't write it, but we're the director, we're the cinematographer. We're casting, we're doing the costumes, we're doing set design, we're doing all of these things. And if you can start to think about each one of those specialties as something that you need to give consideration to, then every one of those is an opportunity, again, to introduce novel solutions to these problems. That is where I will leave you with the sketches and the process on this case study for Treasure Island. Again, narrative art, it is what it says it is. You read the text, you see the pictures, you nod your head, say that's an interesting place, that's an interesting character, that's an interesting story, and it helps flow. It does not disrupt the reader to make them stop and think about what the picture is saying that's at odds with the text. All right, I hope this helps. Everybody, remember to think louder.